So having a background as an academic, I would like to first maybe put a context around these concepts. So what do we actually mean by South-South cooperation or triangular, trilateral cooperation? Because this morning we have heard a lot about these concepts, but I think often they're used in a very confusing way. And so the organizers asked me to kind of define these concepts, so South-South cooperation and trilateral, triangular cooperation, and to also give you some good practices. I will start by defining South-South cooperation. We heard already this morning that the idea of South-South cooperation is that you have developing countries or countries from the global South collaborating, having joint projects or joint programs. In general, we can find in the literature two kind of definitions, or the more technical one, where it's about common procedures, joint learning, having joint projects, or the more political, ideological definition. And this one, I think, is the one that we hear much more in the media. It's about the historical origins of South-South cooperation in the 50s and 60s. We have seen these first initiatives of countries from the South, mostly from Asia and Africa, collaborating. And I'm sure you probably all heard about the famous Bandung conference that was organized in Indonesia in 1955, where it was the first time that really the global South came together. And that led then to other initiatives like the non-alignment movement or the G77 group. And I think this historical background is very important when we talk about South-South cooperation. But when we see South-South cooperation from our perspective today, of course, it's a completely different reality. And we have seen the map, it's really changing. I mean, we see now that there's globalization, there's much more integration between the different parts of the world. So South-South cooperation today is much more global. In the 1950s and 60s, when we were talking about South-South cooperation, it was mostly developing countries or countries from the global South of the same region that were cooperating. So Asian countries, African countries, and Latin America. Now we see South-South cooperation more in terms of really a global phenomenon. So we see India cooperating with African countries, China being very much involved in Africa, India cooperating with countries in Latin America. So it goes beyond this very regional form of cooperation. And I think that is a very important aspect. And that links me to another, I think, new feature of South-South cooperation that is linked to this rise of emerging countries. We often talk about the BRICS, but of course there are also other kinds of emerging countries. And I think this is really the origin of this renewed interest in South-South cooperation. So how does this kind of South-South cooperation fits then with the concept of trilateral or triangular cooperation? I think triangular cooperation is a form of cooperation that fits very well in the kind of environment we have nowadays, where we see that we have countries from the South that cooperate much more, but at the same time we also have these traditional donors. So I'm including, of course, the European Union, European member states, but also the United States, for instance. And they see that they need to engage with these new kind of actors, or what some people call these new donors. And that's the origin of triangular or trilateral cooperation. So there are many definitions that you can find. They're all a bit confusing, but I think the bottom line is that triangular cooperation is a way to build bridges between the traditional North-South cooperation, so between developed countries and developing countries, and these new forms of South-South cooperation. And we had this discussion about why do we call it triangular or trilateral cooperation. My standpoint on this is that it's linked to three actors, and that is very important when we talk about this new type of cooperation, is that we have three different types of actors collaborating, and that's why it's a triangle. And if some of you have read my paper that I submitted, there is a kind of a figure where I put these three actors. And I think it's important to look at the identity of these three actors. So you have, of course, the recipient, developing country, you have an emerging donor, emerging country, and then you have the traditional donor. And these three kind of actors work together in a triangular cooperation mode. If we then go beyond what these three different actors are, it's also important to look at the modes of cooperation and how they differ from this traditional South-South or North-South cooperation. And I think therefore it's important to really look at why South-South cooperation is different from North-South cooperation. And I would identify two elements. The first one would be that South-South cooperation is much more open. It's often driven also by the private sector, and we talked about this also this morning, whereas the traditional North-South cooperation is often state-led. So it was mentioned this morning that traditional donors are part of the OECD Development Assistance Committee, the DAC. The DAC has a specific definition of what aid is. It's the definition of official development assistance, ODA, and there the private element is not that important. It's mostly financial resources that are given by the state. So that's the main difference between North-South cooperation and South-South cooperation. And the other element is that while South-South cooperation is driven by this, as I mentioned, more political point of view, so where it's more about a partnership between equals. Whereas North-South cooperation is this relationship between a donor and the recipient, meaning that, of course, the donor can also attach certain conditions to its development assistance. Whereas with South-South cooperation, there's this aspect of mutual benefit. So both countries engaging in a partnership and both countries receiving something out of this partnership. So I hope that now I could kind of define a bit these different concepts. What I would like to do now very briefly is to give you a good practice of triangular or trilateral cooperation. Although I must admit, I was asked to give you an example of a good practice, but I would rather give you an example of a bad practice. I will focus on the European Union. I did my PhD research on a specific initiative from the European Union that tried to engage in a trilateral cooperation with China and Africa. And I will try to explain why I think it did not really work out. So the idea was that while the European Union is kind of a specific actor, because I defined these three actors that are involved in triangular cooperation, and usually the traditional donor is a member of the OECD Development Assistance Committee, so usually it's a member state. Whereas if you look at the European Union, it's a multilateral organization. The European Union, nevertheless, is part of the OECD DAC, but you also have other multilateral organizations like the UN or the ILO that are engaged in triangular trilateral cooperation. So this makes this picture already a bit more complicated, that we can have triangular or trilateral cooperation also with multilateral organizations. And the example I would like to take is, this trilateral cooperation that the European Union started to initiate with China. Why China? Well, as I mentioned, this new revival of South-South cooperation is very much linked to the rise of emerging countries. And of course, China plays a very important role. We heard this already this morning that, China is involved in South-South cooperation, has a long history of South-South cooperation. And of course, China, as compared to other emerging countries or emerging donors, has much more financial resources at its disposal than other countries, where it's still a bit more difficult. So the idea of the European Union evolved in around, 2005, because since 2000 we actually see really a rise of Chinese influence in Africa. And of course, at the beginning it was something that many European leaders and practitioners were not really comfortable with, but then at one point they realized that they needed to respond to this new reality of South-South cooperation between China and many African countries. And their response was to try to engage in this so-called, the European Union calls it trilateral cooperation. And so around 2007, 2008, there was this first idea to engage in a dialogue. So the European Union, and I'm mostly talking here about the European Commission, that is the main donor organization, tried to engage in a dialogue with Chinese officials to kind of sell this idea to do common projects or to have at least a policy dialogue on how to cooperate in Africa. And then they drafted a nice policy document where they put in some principles and also identified some elements or some themes where they could cooperate. And some of these themes were already mentioned this morning, such as, for instance, the environment, or also, of course, peace and security issues. And they also had some nice principles that they put in this document, such as pragmatic, progressive, shared approach, or effective aid. So these were the kinds of principles that they wanted to structure this trilateral cooperation around. Well, unfortunately, this process was very much driven by the European Union, so the traditional donor, and the idea behind this process was very much also this very traditional North-South cooperation mentality that the European Union wanted to sell its procedures, its modality of cooperation to the Chinese and also to the Africans. And of course, that did not really work out because the main idea of triangular trilateral cooperation is that it's a joint process where all these three different partners put something in together and they come up with new modalities of cooperation. And one, I think, very interesting aspect why I think really this project failed was not only because it was mostly policy initiatives, so there was not this bottom-up approach, so it was not so much focused on concrete projects, but it was more a policy dialogue between officials based in Brussels and Beijing. But it was also because they completely forgot about the African partners. And when we talk about triangular cooperation, or even the core aspect of South-South cooperation is that it has to be driven by the recipient. And that was something that, well, with this initiative, we did not see at all. The main interlocutor that was identified in Africa was the African Union, but the African Union was not even consulted. And when I talked to several practitioners on the field in different African countries, most of them did not even hear about this triangular trilateral cooperation. And so I think this is a very good example how actually a good initiative can fail if you don't really focus on the specific features. And then probably some of the features that you listed here, the European Union just simply did not take into account. And I think it's also sometimes interesting to look at failures to explain what needs to be done to initiate triangular cooperation. And I will stop here because I think I already took a bit too much time.
Well, thank you very much. And I think it's very good not to talk about such a